So we've still got a few more people joining us, so I'm just going to keep admitting people for the next minute or two, and then we'll kick off. So I'm just waiting for a few more people, and then I think we will literally kick off in a second. So apologies, just for those of you who are just joining, we've had a few internet problems. So I'm acting as host and also comparing the sessions as well. So if you just bear with me 1 second. Okay, excellent. All right, well, I think we'll kick off. So thank you for joining us today. So just to introduce the sessions, my name's Dominic Ridley-Moy, and I'm the co-chair of CIPR's Independence Network. And we're really pleased to have Andy Chamberlain with us here today, who is the Director of Policy at the Association of Independent Professionals for the Self-Employed, also known as IPSE. I think it's fair to say that Andy is an expert on IR35 and knows everything there is to know IR35. And for those of you who are not familiar with IPSE's work, they've done some sterling work over the last few years, advising people on what IR35 means for them, campaigning against the changes, lobbying government, and also supporting freelancers caught by IR35. I should say. So he's going to talk a little bit about what IR35 means, how it affects you. So if you work in the public sector, then you're probably pretty familiar with IR35. It's something certainly I've been getting my head around for the last couple of years. But obviously, if you work in the private sector, the new rules will come into force on the 6th of April. So just in terms of, before I hand over to Andy, a few housekeeping rules. So I'm sure you're all very well aware of how to use Zoom. So if you could keep your microphones on mute, please, and feel free to pop any questions you have during the course of the event in chat. And we'll pick those up as we go along. The event's going to be recorded, and if you're a CIPR member, the event is worth 5 CPD points, so do make sure you log that. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andy.
Thanks very much, Dominic. And hello, everyone. And thanks for inviting me on here. So this is all about IR35, which is a sort of technical tax thing. I'm going to skim over all of that stuff, and I really want to get to your questions at the end, because I appreciate that for not everyone finds this stuff as interesting as I do. So we'll keep going. So what we're going to be talking about today is a quick overview of the rules. We're going to look at what's new in IR35, because IR35 is not new in itself. It's been around for 20 years. And those underlying rules of how it applies and when it applies, that's not changing. We're not going to look at that too much as part of this presentation, but if you want to ask me questions afterwards about it, that's absolutely fine. We're really going to look at what this change is and who has to do what in the supply chain now. When I say the supply chain, I mean you've got a client at the top, you've got a contractor at the bottom, you might have some agencies in the middle, and who's doing what within that around IR35. There's this thing called status determination statements, which you might have heard of, or SDSs. What are they? What's all that about? Small company exemptions, quite important, potentially in this sector, very important. Contracted out services may or may not come into this field of relevance for this audience. I'm not sure, but I'll cover it quickly. We'll look at the disputes and how you can reconcile disputes that you might have within it, or how you may not be able to reconcile those disputes, as the case may be. And we'll look a bit at kind of what can you do? What can you do now? Right, we are where we are. So what should people be doing right now around IR35? And then we'll get on to the questions. So I've got about 10 slides. I'm going to go through them pretty fast, but do feel free to ask me questions at the end if anything's not clear, which it may well not be if you're not that familiar with this stuff. So as Dominic mentioned, we've already had this change in the public sector. It came in 2017. So what they did there is they decided, right, these are IR35 rules, which up until then had been up to the individual contractor, the individual basically supplying the services. It'd been up to them to work this out. Does IR35 apply or not? And if they got that wrong, HMRC would go after them. Well, now what they're saying is, no, it's up to the end client to have to wrestle with that, work that out. And if they decide that IR35 applies, then payments to the contractor must be taxed at source, as if that contractor were an employee. As we will see, they are not necessarily an employee. They're just being taxed like an employee. That has its own controversies around it as well. The whole purpose of this private sector was to align it with the public sector. So we're basically, the public sector was the kind of like the blueprint for the government, if you like. This is now, they're now going to make this for everyone. Before I go on, I should just say that, you know, as Dominic did mention, we at IPSE, we lobby against this IR35 change. So although I'm here today to tell you all about how these rules work, and it's just practical advice really, you might pick up a hint here and there of my sort of bitterness and skepticism towards how well these rules will work. I don't intend to do that, but just so you know, I am a bit biased. That's where I come from. But what I'm trying to do today is just simply say, this is how it works. This is what you might need to think about, rather than having a bit of a moan about how we don't like these rules, which would be fun, but not necessarily all that useful. So what do we have that's new within IR35 now? Well, we've got this thing called the SDS, which we're going to look at. We've got the fact that now, which didn't happen in the public sector before, but will now, and in the private sector, that the client, once they've made their decision, they have to explain it directly to the worker themselves before they just sent it down the supply chain. So now your client should be saying to you, this is what we've decided on the IR35 status. We've got this thing called the CES tool, which isn't new, but it's been updated a bit, changed a bit. We've got the small company exemption, that's new. We're going to look at that as well. We've got this thing called liability transfer, which I'm not going to talk about today because it's not that relevant to the actual individual contractor. It's relevant further up the chain. We've got this new ability to challenge a decision. So there's something that your clients have to do. If you say, I disagree with you, there's something that they have to do. But as we will see, we think it's not actually that much that they have to do. So it may not be that useful, that ability to challenge a decision, but it's something that we should be aware of. And yeah, that I think covers. Oh, and there's also something which isn't on here about contracted out services, which isn't necessarily new, but it's something that we must consider more closely now that the rules are changing in the way that they are changing. So here's a graph which kind of explains how IR35 works. So I'll just go over this quickly. If you see a box with the yellow around it, that means that that entity has to make this decision. They have to decide, does IR35 apply here, yes or no? And if they've got the red box around them, that means that they are liable for deducting the tax. They're not always the same entity, as we will see. So if we look at the left-hand column, there the client is small. In all of the other columns, the client is not small. So in the left-hand column, because the client is small, the PSC, that stands for Personal Service Company, which some of you might know. Now, by the way, that's not a term which has any legal definition to it, but we sort of know what they mean. They mean the contractor's limited company. It's a phrase used to describe a certain type of limited company, but in fact, that limited company is the same as any other limited company in law, but that's what the PSC means. In that left-hand column, the PSC has to think, does IR35 apply? And I'm the one who has to deal with the tax consequences of that if it does. they don't have to deduct tax from any payments to themselves. They can do that laterally. They can do something called a deemed calculation, where they pay it at the end of the year. So that's a bit different to the rest of the examples we're going to see here. But the key thing to point out there is, in the left-hand column, that's how IR35 works right now and has done in the private sector for the last 20 years since it was invented. That's what's changing. So if we move over to the next column, we have a fairly simple supply chain again, where there's no agencies or anything. So it's just a client and a contractor, one of you guys. The worker inside their own limited company is the contractor inside the PSC. And because the client here is not small, they have the responsibility for working out whether IR35 applies. And because they are paying the contractor, because there's no one else in the chain to pay them, they have to then make sure, if I've decided IR35 applies, I've got to do this on the payroll, take the tax off before I pay the contractor, give the tax over to the taxman. In the middle one, we see we've got an agency in the chain. So the only thing that's changed here is the client still has to work out whether IR35 applies. They have to explain that to the agency and directly to the worker, as I said before. And then the agency who is paying the contractor, they have to take the money off the tax, do the pay in net and put it on a payroll. And then you see the next one along, you've got two agencies, but it's the agency who's paying the contractor. It's whoever pays the contractor, they have the liability to deduct the tax. They are called the fee payer for the purposes of this legislation. That's the phrase that you might hear. But whatever happens, it's the end client that has to make the decision on whether IR35 applies. In the final column there, I'm not going to dwell on this because there's this thing about contracted out services. I just don't know whether this is that relevant to this audience or not. But it's possible that the end client has said, you know, I would like a service from a service provider, and I'm going to go to that service provider and get that done. And I don't have any responsibility for any IR35 status decisions underneath that service provider. That's up to the service provider. And there are rules over what's a contracted out service and what isn't. And they're just as complicated as pretty much the IR35 rules are generally. So I'm not going to dwell on it. I think I've got a quick slide on it. Oh, here it is, yeah. So the thing about contracted out services, as an example, if a bank decides we want some food to happen for our staff within our offices, then they will go to a catering company and they will say to that catering company, make food happen, please, for our staff. And then if that catering company is engaging anyone via personal service companies or anything else, that's up to the catering company to worry about. The bank is the ultimate end client here, but it's a fully contracted out service. And I think in that example, we could all agree that is a fully contracted out service. You know, the bank's not going to have any oversight of how the catering company is staffing itself. However, let's imagine a less straightforward example where the bank goes to a consultancy to get some people in to do a bit of banking, but it's not quite the same as their normal business as usual banking. Then HMRC could come along and say, you're really just body chopping in some bankers here. So you are the client, and the contracted out service provider is actually acting like an agency, and therefore it's not a contracted out service. The reason why this is somewhat important to a lot of people, and I'm sorry, forgive me, I just don't know whether it'll be important to you too much, is some people are saying, let's arrange ourselves via a consultancy. We'll offer services as a contracted out service, and that way we don't have to worry about, our clients won't have to worry about this IR35 thing, and we won't have to worry about it. Well, we will have to worry about it, but we can make sure we stay outside of IR35. I don't know whether that's really going to work, but I think there are instances of it happening already out there. People are trying to reorganize their affairs, and possibly quite compliantly, but this is where I think we could see more movement in the sector, and maybe in this sector, you might see that too. I don't know. It might be interesting in the questions section afterwards, if any of you have seen opportunities to work via consultancies or had conversations with your colleagues about setting up a consultancy. And you get this thing called statement of work contracts, which might tie in with this. It's the way of putting a contract together which kind of outlines what the scope of a project is, rather than saying, I'm going to turn up for you and work every day and get paid X per day. A statement of work contract might say, I'm going to deliver you this, these are the timelines, these are the milestones, maybe I'll be paid on delivery of certain milestones. And it's a way of sort of demonstrating that this can't be confused with a employment, and therefore the IR35 doesn't apply. If I'm going too fast on this stuff, don't worry, I can talk at the end. I know that what I haven't done yet is sort of explain what IR35 really is, and maybe that's, but I just wanted to like get through what this change is. I'm very happy to talk about that as well. I'm not sure if people know already or they don't, but very happy to talk about it more at the end and how we determine when IR35 applies and when it doesn't and all of that. Small company exemption. So if you as we saw in that chart, if the company's small, they don't have to worry about all this. So as we were, it's the same old IR35 as we've already had. Us tax geeks call that Chapter 8. It's Chapter 8 of the Income Tax Earnings and Pensions Act. That legislation is still in place for when the end client is small. For everything else, it's Chapter 10, but don't worry about that too much. If the client is small, they have to meet 2 of those 3 criteria that you can see in front of you there. Basically, they have to have equal to or less than 50 employees, equal to or less than 10.2 million on turnover, equal to or less than 5.1 million on the balance sheet. If you meet 2 of those, you're small for the purpose of this legislation, and therefore that end client doesn't have to worry about all this stuff about IR35. It is an advantage for some people to think, if I work with small clients, then I can decide my own IR35 status, and I could trust myself more to get that right. This thing called the SDS, bit of confusion around this. What this is a formalization of the determining sort of process, really. So the end client, if they're not small, they have to provide an SDS, and the SDS must say that whether IR35 applies or not, how they came to that decision, and they must take reasonable care. If they do all 3 of those things, they must take reasonable care in making the IR35 decision. If they do all of those things, they've done the SDS. They then need to communicate it onto the worker and down the supply chain. The reasonable care provision broadly has been interpreted to mean clients can't just say IR35 applies to everyone. I can't really be bothered to look at it. It looks a bit confusing. They have to do a proper assessment. But there are some ways around that. They can just say everyone can just go on the payroll, and then I don't have to do an IR35 assessment at all. Don't have to do an SDS at all. But that's what the SDS is all about. If the client doesn't do an SDS when they should do, then they become liable for all the tax that should have been deducted further down the supply chain. The client-led dispute resolution service. This was the old-fashioned word for it in the consultations. I mean, what this is all about is, for the first time now, there is in place within the legislation, and that you could the text you can see there is from the legislation itself, which enables a contractor who's been told, or a worker or consultant, or I'm not sure what words you recognise, but the worker that's now going to be deemed as inside IR35, the deemed employee, if you like. They can say to the client, I disagree with your determination and I'd like to challenge it. But all that the legislation says, as you can see there, is that the client then has 45 days in which to get back to them, at which point they have to say, yes, actually, you're right, and we'll give you a new SDS, or, sorry, we still think we were right all along, we're sticking to our initial SDS. That's it. It doesn't say that they have to reason with any of the evidence they're provided. And there's no sort of access to any sort of arbitration service which could be independent. So yeah, look, we're saying it's worth doing it if you disagree with your client's status determination, but it's not, it's possible that the client will just say, okay, thanks, I'll get back to you in 45 days, and then they'll say, yeah, we were right all along. There's nothing much you can do about it beyond that, unfortunately. So it's a bit of a weak kind of right that contractors have. What does all this mean then? So what does all of this mean? So that's the sort of technical bit. Well, what this means is, if your client decides that IR35 applies, it's likely that you're going to end up paying more tax than you were paying, or that you would pay if they decided that IR35 did not apply. You'll also have to pay things like employer's NI, probably. Not necessarily, but quite possibly. And that is controversial. We'll talk about that bit afterwards, perhaps. It means that you can't claim expenses in the same way, you know, that you could do when you were operating as a contractor outside of IR35. So it will mean that if you're traveling a long way to certain gigs, or if you have travel and accommodation expenses, sort of overnight stays and things, it will mean that they could become unviable financially, because you can't claim some of those expenses back. It is possible that your employment status will change, that, as I said before, not necessarily. So for your tax status will change, because your tax status will now be that you are employed for tax purposes only. Your employment status won't necessarily change. However, if you end up working via an umbrella arrangement, which is a sort of payroll company, then probably the umbrella company will employ you technically. But then are they really your employer? You know, they don't know you. They've got no idea what you're doing. They're not based anywhere near you. You know, you might travel to work 5 miles between your home and your client's office. The client really is like your employer, isn't it? But the umbrella company is technically legally your employer. I'm happy to talk about umbrellas. I think we might talk about that a bit after the slides as well. So that's one thing that might happen. So this is, I think, my last slide really. What should you be doing now then about IR35? Well, look, you might have already had discussions with your client. The deadline, as Dominic said, for this is the 6th of April. So they should have issued it at SDS by now, really. But if they haven't, then you might want to talk to them about it, because it might be that they're suddenly going to wake up and go, oh my God. And then you might want to get in front of that conversation and say, look, I've looked at all this and I think I'm outside of IR35. You might not want to talk to your client, because you might think, well, if they're not saying anything about it, I won't say anything about it, and we'll just carry on. But sooner or later, that will probably catch up with you. So generally, we're saying it might be a good idea, if you haven't spoken to your client, to go and talk to them. One thing that you can do is get your contract independently reviewed. IPSE has a contract review service, but we're not the only ones out there. They will assess the contract, the written contract, and potentially the working practice. You fill in a questionnaire, and they'll tell you whether they think this is outside of IR35 or not. You can then present that to your client as evidence of why you think the role is outside of IR35, which the client doesn't have to accept. But if you were to do one of those challenges, that could be a good thing to do. There's also this thing called the CESS tool, Check Employment Status for Tax. It's a government tool. We actually don't like the tool, and many clients are using it and making determinations based on it, and we think they're often getting them wrong. But you can go on there anonymously. You don't have to give your name, and HMRC don't keep a record of the fact that anyone's been on there. And if it gives you an answer that is helpful to you, you can share that with your client as well and say, look, I've done the CESS tool. You know, now they might disagree with how you've answered the questions, so it's not the be all and end all, but it is something that you could go and look at, have a play around with it. See if you know if what it says about your engagement when you answer the questions as honestly as you can do. And if you don't like the answer, you don't have to show it to anyone, so you've got nothing to lose. Challenge the SDS with your client. Again, you've got nothing to lose. I think it is a bit of a weak provision. You know, I think that it could be stronger, but if you disagree with your client, you might as well say to them, look, I think this is wrong, but give them some evidence as well, you know, like the contract review, like the CESS tool. Talk to them about why you think the role is outside of IR35. You could increase your day rate. You could say to them, if you're saying that this is now affecting my tax position quite substantially, so I would need to have an uplift in day rate. Now, that's not always commercially feasible. It depends on your relationship with your client, but it's something to consider. It could be an opportunity to lift up that day rate. You might want to consider contracted out services, the whole consultancy thing, statement of work. But one thing I would say about that is it can't be a sham. You know, you can't just carry on as normal and say, well, now I'm operating via consultancy and I've got a statement of work contract. HMRC will look through that, and probably your client will too. And it'll be your client that will be on the hook, actually, if it turns out they didn't do an SDS when they should have done, because they bought a line that, oh, this is a contracted out service. So, you know, you might not be able to convince your client about that, unless you can talk to them about properly actually doing that. But that probably involves, well, it depends. You might be close to doing that already, but for many people, that would involve really restructuring the way they offer their services. Watch out for dodgy umbrellas. Sorry for the use of the word dodgy in the slide. It's a bit colloquial, but umbrella companies are an unregulated market. So some of them are compliant, but some of them aren't that compliant. And some of them are making use of tax avoidance schemes. Some people who ended up with this thing called the loan charge, you might have heard a lot about that a couple of years ago. That was all done via dodgy umbrellas. So it's a very unregulated market. So take advice from people. You know, who do you know? Do you know anyone else in this boat? Go onto forums and things. What umbrella companies are other people using? People that you trust. I would recommend that you do that. And if you see an umbrella company saying, hey, don't worry about IR35, you can still take home 90% of your day rate, they're probably dodgy. So stay clear. And remember that although the rules are changing from April the 6th onwards, you're still liable for your IR35 position for the last 6 years. So HMRC could come along and investigate any one of your contracts in the last 6 years And if you hadn't operated IR35 on it previously, they could say you should have done. So it's worth, if you have IR35 investigation insurance in place, it's worth keeping it. IPSA membership comes with IR35 investigation insurance as well. So come and have a look at us if you think that that's going to be useful to you. That's all my slides done. I have gone on a bit, sorry. But I hope that you found that useful, and I'd really be happy to take any questions at all on this stuff.
Okay, that's great, Andy. That was really, really useful. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to the questions because we've had quite a few in. So what I'll try and do is bunch them all up together. So what I was going to say, do let me know if you think an explanation from Andy of IR35 will be useful. Do put that in the chat if that is definitely useful. There's certainly been a few questions around substitution. So I'm just going to pick up on those ones and try and bunch them together. So one of the tests around IR35 and how HMRC look at whether or not you're in an or outside IR35 is whether you can send a substitute in to do your work. So one of the questions was, I have associates I can pass work to when needed, but there's no formal paperwork. Do I need to look at this? So I've heard the phrase memorandum of understanding as a solution. And then there was a question about putting a clause in the contract. So whether it's a kind of thing, I suppose you need to do informally, or whether it's a case of whether it will just happen in practice. So I think that's the ones we've had on substitution. So if you just want to pick up on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the substitution point, yeah, absolutely right. This is one of the three main tests of IR35 status. So it probably is helpful, actually. And forgive me, I probably should have done this at the start. So what IR35 is all about is saying, look, if you were directly employed, the taxman would be getting more tax than they do when you say, well, I'm offering my services via my own limited company. So IR35 is about saying, if we just took your company out of this for a minute and we looked at this, would we say that that is an employment? And therefore, could we say right now that because you've got the company in there, what this really is a disguised employment? IR35 is all about sorting that out and saying, yeah, no, we don't want you to have a tax advantage because we think this is really just an employment. So we're going to apply this employment taxes to this engagement. That's what IR35 is basically all about. How do we work out whether IR35 applies or not? How do we work out if this is basically an employment? We look at substitution or personal service, control and mutuality of obligations. So these questions are all about substitution. So absolutely right, this is one of the main factors. In order for the substitution thing to sort of absolve you from IR35, it has to be an unfettered right to substitution that the contractor has. It has to be more than just a clause in a contract, though it's important to have it in the written contract. If you don't have it in the written contract, HMRC will say, well, no substitution clauses in here. If you do have it in the written contract, HMRC will say, yeah, but that's just a clause, isn't it? Could it happen really in practice? So the way that it should work is that you have the ability to say to your client, look, next week it's not going to be me, it's going to be Sarah or Jeff or Susan. And the client just goes, yeah, sure, that's fine, because you have an unfettered right to send that substitute. If you have to go to your client and say, look, would you mind? It would really help me out if I could send someone else. And they say, oh, I don't know, who is it? I'm not sure. Oh, okay, then that might not be seen as an unfettered right to substitute. The example that I sometimes give on this stuff is that in our office, we have a water cooler and we have a contract with a water cooler company to send people in to faff about with it every now and again and make it work and service it or whatever. And sometimes they send Steve and sometimes they send Bob, and they don't even tell us whether they're going to send Steve or Bob, and we don't care. And we don't have a right to reject either Steve or Bob. As long as the water cooler gets serviced, we're happy. The company has performed its duties, we pay them. That's how the substitution should work, even inside a contractual relationship. Of course, it doesn't really work like that, does it? Because we're all human beings and our clients got used to working with us as a human, and there is an aspect to the services that we're providing which are personal necessarily. But nevertheless, you can get into people you actually can send substitutes. So it's all about just getting that teed up. As for the paperwork, one of the key things is that if you do send the substitute in to perform the role for you, then you pay that substitute. It shouldn't be that the client is paying you this week, but next week they pay your substitute. It should be that the client pays your company for the services that sometimes you provide and occasionally this substitute will provide, but the client is paying your company. When you have, if the substitute needs to get paid, it gets paid by your company, not by the client.
Can I just pick up quickly? I'm keeping an eye on some of what you're saying in questions. You may have covered it. But how do you kind of prove that in practice that you've substituted? I've always worked on the assumption that if I pay someone an invoice and that being a record would actually demonstrate that I've actually substituted work. But it'd be good to hear what your views are on how you demonstrate that in practice.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it really has happened, it really has happened. There will be evidence of it. Yeah, even if you've just got some emails with your substitute saying you going in, how did you get on last week type thing, like all of that is enough. I mean, the client will back it up too, won't they, if they were ever asked by HMRC. But all of this is slightly thinking about the old-fashioned IR35 or the Chapter 8, as I said before. In the new world of IR35. The important thing is that if the client is going to say that IR35 does not apply here, they have to be satisfied that you have a right to substitute, which means they're going to have to decide, I don't have a right to reject a substitute. If Andy Chamberlain Limited, instead of sending Andy Chamberlain one week, sends Susan or Jeff or Sarah or whatever I said before, then the client has to just decide, yeah, I'd be cool with that. As long as they do what they're supposed to do, I'm fine with it. So this is where it gets difficult, because I think a lot of clients are going to be reluctant to say, I don't have a right to reject that substitute. So when they're asked this question inside the CES tool or inside their own IR35 process, when they're working out, does IR35 apply to Andy Chamberlain's role here? They're going to say, would I accept it if he just sent someone in? They might say, he might send in a lunatic. Yes, I've got a right to reject a substitute, in which case you've sort of knocked away the substitution thing. That doesn't mean that you're caught by IR35. There are other ways out of the IR35 puzzle.
Yeah, I was just, Andy, can I just interrupt there? Could you just pick up on that? Because I know I'm a kind of independent practitioner, and there's quite a few sole traders. So I think there's probably two bits. If we could just quickly pick up on substitution. So what if you're a sole trader and you can't, you don't actually physically have a substitute? And then also if you can say a little bit about how it works for sole traders, i.e. do you have to use a public service company, or can you do it without, how that kind of works?
So if you're a sole trader, what we mean is you are an unincorporated business, right? That's what, just so we have to be clear, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a self-employed person who doesn't have a company. This time it's just, sorry, I'm not trying to be a megalomaniac, it's just simpler for me to use my own name to explain this. Rather than Andy Chamberlain Limited, it's just Andy Chamberlain, and I'm just a self-employed person, and I go around offering my services to clients, and they pay me. They don't pay it into my company, they pay me directly, and I pay a different type of tax. I don't pay corporation tax because I'm not incorporated. Now, for those sole traders, IR35 does not apply. Okay, so there's a bit of confusion around this. However, there are pre-existing rules which impact sole traders, which work in a bit of a similar way to this new world of IR35. In other words, if a client pays me gross, just as Andy Chamberlain, the self-employed sole trader, and HMRC think, no, that's like an employment really, they will go after the client and they'll say, you should have deducted tax from those payments to Andy Chamberlain, and it becomes my client's problem. It is for this reason that we saw a huge growth in the number of limited companies over the last 20 years, because clients didn't want to engage sole traders. It opened up that risk to them. And until this rule's come along, as long as there was a limited company in the middle of the supply chain, all that risk sat within that limited company, not with the end client. So they were quite happy to pay a limited company gross because there was no comeuppance for them. Now that's changing because these are IR35 rules. So sole traders not impacted by IR35, but already impacted a bit by something pretty similar is probably the easiest way to say it.
Okay, and then I'm just going to pick up on one of the points just about the kind of the CES tool and how you can check determine status. So I think there is an online tool that HMRC use called the CES tool. So if you want to determine your status, you can use that. And certainly, I think when it first came out, it was fair to say it was pretty awful. It's much better than it was now. And I tried it, I think, a couple of days ago, and the questions are certainly better. But I mean, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of using it are? And would you recommend that people use other tools if they have an issue with that, and what your thoughts are on that, really?
Can I stop sharing now, because then I might be able to see everyone? Is that because I've only got, well, oh, that's better. I can see, or most people haven't got their cameras on anyway, but I can see your names, so that's fine. CES tool, yeah. So we don't particularly like the CES tool because we think it's critically flawed, actually. One of the main reasons why we don't like it is because I mentioned there are these three main tests for IR35 status, which is substitution, control, and this really even more difficult thing to explain than everything else, mutuality of obligation. The CES tool does not test for mutuality of obligation at all, because HMRC have taken the view that there is always mutuality of obligation or mutual obligations between the parties inside any contract. The courts disagree with that. Most courts disagree with that, I would say. I think that's safe to say that, and we disagree with it. So we therefore think because you don't test for that, you can't really get a true judgment on someone's IR35 status. However, having said that, therefore, I don't like it when I hear that clients are using the CES tool to determine your or contractors, individuals' IR35 status. I suspect that could lead them to getting that status wrong, and is more likely, if it is going to get it wrong, it's more likely to get it wrong as in it's inside IR35 than it is to get it wrong the other way around. However, the CES tool is anonymous, and you can go on and use it as an individual, as I said before. So you can just Google it, find it, and go on there. It's anonymous. HMRC don't keep any record of it. No one else has to know that you've even ever done it. And if you answer those questions, you might as well answer them honestly, because otherwise, sooner or later, someone will challenge how you got the answer that you've got. But if you answer them honestly and you come out with an outcome that's actually helpful to you, it might say that IR35 does not apply. Then you can take that off and use it when in discussions with your client. I mean, you might as well. So yeah, by all means, go and have a look at it. But if someone else was determining my IR35 status and they were only using the CES tool, I would be worried about that, because I have doubts as to how accurate the CES tool is. And even if it actually is a little bit biased towards sticking me in IR35 when I shouldn't be.
I'm just going to pick up something very quickly. I've just put in the chat, and we'll share this afterwards. If you are looking for template contracts, I've just shared the link for CIPR members. There's some template contracts and clauses that you can use, particularly if you're going through public service companies, but I've also used clauses from that as a sole trader. So if you're a CIPR member, you can use those template clauses, and they have been checked over legally as well. I'm just going to pick up on two very quick questions, and then I'll come back to some of the more complex ones. So what's the situation if your clients are based outside of the UK? And can you just say a little bit about expenses? So if you end up being inside IR35, what's the implication for expenses, holiday pay, all that kind of thing?
Okay, so well, on that one, on expenses, there's quite a lot of expenses that you can't claim once you're inside of IR35. It gets a lot harder to do it. So there is still some options and possibilities for you to do something on your self-assessment tax return at the end of the year. But the key thing... Oh, sorry, Siri.
Siri can't help.
Siri just, yeah, annoying. Robots everywhere. Sorry. The key thing to remember is that before you got paid gross, right? And then you could take all your expenses out of that. So before you're paying any tax, you're already doing those deductions yourself. You say, after all my expenses, this is my profit, and I will now go and work out how much tax I owe on that. Well, now all of your money is getting taxed at source. So it's not taking into account when it's being taxed your expenses. Now you may well still have some expenses, like many of you might still want to carry PI cover, and you might have expenses on some equipment, whatever it might be, and it might be that you can claim some of that back on your self-assessment return at the end of the year, essentially you'd be saying, I've overpaid tax here, I want some of it back. But it's harder to do than it was before. The travel and subsistence expenses, they're the real killer, because they changed the rules a few years ago, and they said that anyone working inside IR35 cannot claim travel and subsistence expenses. What that means is, if you're outside of IR35 and you get a gig in that requires you to go to Manchester from London 3 times a week, that's obviously going to rack up over, say, a 6-month contract, and you can claim all of that back because it's your travel expenses. You can't do that if you're inside IR35. So that then makes you think, well, I won't take that work opportunity in Manchester. Now, this is one of the other reasons why we don't like these rules, because it's a bit of a work killer. We're depriving people of opportunities and, stopping the market working as well as it should do, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of broadly how the expenses work. What was the other question, Dominic? Sorry, I've totally...
Just about being based overseas. So if you have
overseas clients, yeah.
Overseas,
if the client is wholly overseas, then IR35, these new rules do not apply. You're back to Chapter 8, i.e. it's up to you, the individual contractor, to worry about your IR35 status. But of course, HMRC is going to have a hard time proving that IR35 applies to an engagement with your client that's in America, because they're not even going to talk to them, and they're not going to know whether you're controlled or not, etc. So but technically you retain that responsibility. If, however, the overseas client has a branch or an office or part of that business in the UK, then HMRC can go to that UK part of the business and say, you were supposed to issue an SDS here, and so we're going to hold you liable. So there is a sort of link back to overseas clients. So for example, if you're working for Deutsche Bank or something in Germany, we know that there is a Deutsche Bank in the UK. So Deutsche Bank in the UK has got to think about any UK-based taxpayer contractors that are working in Germany for Deutsche Bank, and they'll have to issue an SDS. So how all this is actually going to work, no one quite knows yet, because you can see it's going to get pretty complicated, but that's how the legislation works technically.
Okay, thank you. Right, so moving on, I've got a question here about, I've been asked by one client to get insurance in case they are found to need to treat me as an employee. Is such a thing available? And who are good providers?
I don't know about in case of an employee. What we are seeing is that there are more and more contracts coming up saying that the contractor will in some way indemnify the parties above them in the chain. So you might have seen, we've seen a few of this happening more and more. Essentially what they're saying is that the client's happy to say that this is outside of IR35. The agency then is saying, we're happy to accept that and not tax you at source and carry on paying you gross. But HMRC might come along at some point and disagree with all this and hold us liable for that. So we're going to put a clause in the contract saying that you indemnify us against that. So if HMRC want any extra money, you have to pay it to us. Now, it's yet to be proven whether those indemnity clauses could actually work. They haven't been yet tested in the court. It is, I think, 50-50, that one. I just don't know the answer, because it's definitely a grey area, because the legislation is clear. It makes the fee payer is liable. Mm. I'm not sure that the fee payer can then just sort of absolve itself of those liabilities via some contractual clauses. I don't know that it's that easy for them to do that, and just say, let's make the contractor or the agency could get some insurance in place, but that's a bit different to saying that the contractor we're going to palm off the liabilities of the contractor and therefore they have to get the insurance. So, but it's not unusual. So it's a grey area. I'm afraid I don't know the answer of whether or not it will be, if it ever got to a court, it'd be interesting to see what the court would say about it. Would they say that that's an enforceable clause or not? I don't know.
Because I suppose that's the thing, there's quite a few things, and certainly for me, there's been lots of times when I've filled in the CES tool in the past and the determination has come back as inconclusive. So I think there's a question mark about what you do then if you're not sure, if the person engaging you and you're not sure if you're in and out and it's not determined, and whether you'd suggest at that point whether you get some sort of IR35 contract review, speak to your lawyer, accountant, that kind of thing. Where would you suggest we go if you've kind of got that inclusivity, inconclusive determination and you're not really sure where to go forward?
Yeah, well, another one of the imperfections of the CES tool, as you say, is that sometimes in about 15% of cases, it will just say, we don't know whether IR35 applies to this engagement. So what happens then? Well, first of all, we'd say, look, there's other ways to establish your IR35 status. There are other tools out there. There's commercially produced tools. I mean, some of the big firms like Grant Thornton and Deloitte have got their own tools that they're helping their clients to do their IR35 assessments. You can also go to independent IR35 assessment experts. They go into companies and do all their IR35 assessments for them. And you can just look at, you can use your own, some firms are just doing it in-house. They're just saying, we're going to read up a bit on IR35 and do our own assessments. Ultimately, the client has to make a decision. They can't say, the SDS can't say, we can't decide. The SDS has to say, IR35 applies or IR35 doesn't apply. And so, yeah, you can do a contract review. Indeed, you basically go out into the market if you don't know yourself. But this is, I'm talking really here for the clients. I mean, if you're a contractor and you can't decide whether IR35 applies, well, it doesn't really matter what you think anymore, but assuming your client is medium or large in size, because they're the ones who are going to decide this. So, it's them, they've got to make this decision. You don't. If your client is small, you do have to make this decision. But what most contractors do is they say, unless they think it's bang to rights, definitely inside IR35, they say, I'm going to say it's outside of IR35 and I'm going to get some tax investigation insurance in place so that if HMRC ever come along and disagree with that, I've got some help backing me up to make that argument. And I'll get my contract professionally reviewed and I'll try to make sure I've got my affairs in order so that I stay on the right side of the IR35 line. Yeah. But it's a grey area of the IR35
thing. Because there's a few questions. Sorry. I was just going to say there's a few questions, and I know this comes up. There's an example here of someone saying they've self-employed, mainly work for an associate of a PR agency. Their main client, utility company, said they will no longer use the agency to use associates because of IR35. So I'd now have to go on the agency's payroll on a 0 hours contract. Are they allowed to insist on this?
Yes, they are allowed to insist that you go on a payroll. What they're not allowed to do is say everyone's caught by IR35 and therefore they have to go on a payroll, but they can decide everyone has to go on a payroll because that's just the company policy that we've decided upon, which is, I know it's the same result, it's a bit weird, but this is exactly what happened in all the big banks last year. When we thought these rules were coming in last year, they were delayed by a year because of the pandemic. And a lot of the big banks just said, we're not going to get involved in this IR35 thing. It looks like a nightmare. We don't want to get in trouble with HMRC. So we're just going to say everyone's got to go and get onto a payroll somewhere. It could be agency payroll. It could be an umbrella company that's now inserted into the chain and becomes the fee payer and therefore is deducting the tax. So yeah, that unfortunately, they can just say, if you want to work here, you've got to be on payroll. And then it's kind of up to you to say, well, do I want to work here or not? I can go and try and find work elsewhere. But at the moment, we're seeing a lot of this kind of overreaction. A lot of clients and a lot of agencies are saying, just payroll. It's got to be payroll, 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 payroll. Our hope is that over time that will change actually, and that clients and agencies will begin to get a bit more savvy and understand they can put people outside of IR35 and can pay them gross.
I think probably this next question probably leads on to a bit of a plug for IPSI, which is, it really just, where's the best place to kind of get resources to find out a bit more? So just I suppose things like all the kind of different advice to read up more on it, all that kind of stuff. And I know certainly the stuff that I've read from yourselves has been really, really helpful, but where would you recommend people can find out more information?
Yeah, well, we do have information which is not just for our members. You can access it. We've got a guide to IR35, which is up on our website. We've got an IR35 hub. Some of it becomes closed off, but most of it isn't. So you can go and read up around that. There's loads of pages on gov.uk website around this stuff too, and it's not too bad. But obviously, gov.uk websites is pretty hard to read at the best of times, and then you throw in off payroll working and IR35 into the mix, and most people kind of get quite turned off by that prospect. But there is stuff on there. there's a very good House of Commons library paper all about IR35 and sort of history of it and where it's come from, which is helpful to sort of understand this. There's a whole litany of resources out there actually, which are people trying to explain what these rules are and how they work. And most of it's, you know, pretty accurate, and some of it you'll find some conflicting information because people can disagree on IR35 and what it means. Like,
Yeah.
we disagree with HMRC on some aspects of it.
And how much of a difference do you think it does make if you've gone out and got a lawyer or someone like that to provide some advice, and they've provided that reassurance? How much of a difference do you think that would provide in an investigation if it were come to that?
Yeah, I think it can make a difference. So the way, again, this is slightly thinking of the old Chapter 8, but bearing in mind you're still liable for the last 6 years here. So this is the position that contractors have been dealing with quite a lot. HMRC could come along any minute and they could say, well, you did this engagement with this firm, you know, 3 years ago. We think IR35 applied there. What do you think? If you can turn around to them at that stage and you can say, actually, I take IR35 compliance very seriously in all my engagements, and I can see here that I had my contract reviewed professionally, I sought external advice, I got this in place, that in place, then HMRC are likely to look at you and go, you're not the sort of soft target we were looking for. And they may move on to the next one pretty swiftly because they can see that there's already some evidence there which points to IR35 not applying. If you turn around and say, IR30 what, then they might think, okay, we might be on something here. So yes, I think it's helpful. I wouldn't want to encourage people to spend lots and lots of money with lawyers unnecessarily, but a little bit of advice where you can just get something down on paper, keep a record of it, which shows that IR35 does not apply, that you have reasonable grounds to assume that IR35 does not apply to that particular engagement. That's a pretty good thing to be doing, as and when you can.
And I'm just looking at a question here. So I think that leads on to kind of things like tax investigation, insurance, all that kind of thing. There was a question about someone having that and the cost was pretty high. So I suppose, would you recommend that sort of insurance? And do you provide recommendations for suppliers?
Well, not really, because we are one. So if you join IPSE, then you have tax investigation insurance as part of your membership. We have 3 different membership levels, which range between, for the tax investigations, well, basically it's the IPSE Plus membership is 350 quid a year. So it doesn't get more expensive than that. So it's not too bad. Plus you get other stuff as well with your IPSE membership. I'm not really a salesman. I'm not really trying to sort of sell it. But yes, I would recommend, even if you don't have IPSE membership, I would recommend that you have tax investigation insurance in place if you are operating on your own. You know, the tax world is a difficult world to navigate, and people get it wrong quite often, and I don't blame them because it's very, very complicated. And it's good to know that if HMRC ever did come knocking at your door, you've got someone that will come in and have that kind of discussion with HMRC on your behalf. And that's what tax investigation insurance does. And you do still have, I mean, IR35 is just one way you can be investigated. It just so happens that those investigations do tend to be particularly difficult because of the complexities of IR35. They can go on for years. They can be very, very stressful, very, very disruptive to your business. So yeah, it's good to have that insurance in place. IPSE membership's one way of doing it. There are others.
I'm conscious of time. I think we've only got about 5 minutes left. Have we covered rolling contracts? I'm not sure that we have, how that works.
A rolling contract, look, there's nothing wrong with a rolling contract, but HMRC is likely to, first of all, if they're going to investigate one, they'll look back at the whole engagement, and that they won't necessarily just say, well, there's that contract, we'll look at that one, that time frame. They'll probably look at the whole engagement. Does it make you more likely that you're going inside IR just because you roll on to a next contract? Not really, no. In fact, there's no time limit on an engagement. So you could work with one client exclusively for 20 years and still be outside of IR35 in theory. But most people, I think, would look at it and say, well, you should have been employed, really. So I think that it becomes harder to make your case. I think the tribunal will feel less sympathetic towards you if you've been in an engagement for a long time on a rolling contract basis. Is that what the question was getting at on rolling contracts, or have I misunderstood it, Dominic?
Yeah, I think that was yes. No, the person who's asked it has just come back and said yes. So, and then I suppose that kind of a similar question is, do you need to do the self-determination test every time you start a new piece of work, if it's with the same end client or not, or whether you can...
Right, so same end client, but potentially like a different project, yeah? So,
So yeah, I think so.
I think you'd want to get in, because this is where the mutuality of obligation thing gets a bit involved in this sort of space as well. But ideally, if you've agreed a project with a client, that's one contract. If the client then says to you, hey, do you know what, actually, we'd like to also do this, you should say, okay, fine, but we'll have to renegotiate that and get a new contract in place to deliver that one separately. That's how you should do it, because otherwise it begins to look a bit like you've got an employment type relationship where you've got an employer and you're the employee, and they're saying, hey, can you do this? Oh no, actually now I want you to do that, and can you go over there and do that now, please? So that becomes a danger. So yes, as much as possible, have clear contractual boundaries for each unique project that you're doing, even if that is with the same client. Is helpful.
Okay, and then we've had a question here is, can HMRC treat our limited company as in or outside of IR35 with different clients, or is it generally the limited company that is in or out?
You just cut out me a bit there. Sorry, I think it's the limit. It's not the limited company or the contractor that's in or out of IR35. It is the engagement. So, sorry, I'll just use the same example again. So Andy Chamberlain Limited could have, and I can see Catherine and Penny are next to me on the screens here. So I can have one contract with Catherine Limited and one contract with Penny Limited, and my Catherine contract could be caught by IR35 and my Penny contract might not be outside of IR35. So it's all about the nature of that engagement and what's going on. That it's about the characteristics of that relationship that you have between the client and the worker. So it's not about my company is caught by IR35 or I'm caught by IR35. It's about a specific engagement and whether that is caught. Did that answer your question, Dominic? I'm sorry, I slightly missed the start.
And I think we had a follow-up question here about are retainers difficult? But I think my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the same thing applies, that retainers are not difficult. It's more about the engagement and whether it looks or feels like employment rather than having a retainer as such.
Yeah, I think retainers are slightly difficult, actually, because you get into this grounds, it's this whole mutuality of obligation thing. But within the retainer, one of the things is, if you're being paid a retainer, if the client does click their fingers, do you have to then jump and go? Because if you do, that does, I think, that does point towards IR35 applying. Not necessarily, because you could be able to send a substitute. There's other ways out of it, the whole control thing, who's controlling the work that you do. But I think that that's possibly a point. If you're on a retainer with a client, it's possibly a pointer towards IR35. But as I say, you might have other things in place which take you out of it. So it's not, none of these things are be all and end all. There's different ways out of the IR35 puzzle. But being on a retainer with a client is I would say not that helpful for your IR35 status.
Oh, that's helpful, thank you. And then I'm going to say one final question, and then I think I'm going to draw it to a close as we're nearly out of time, which is just about if you could explain control briefly as kind of one of the key tests.
Yeah, so one of the key tests is how much autonomy does the worker have over the work that they're doing. So an employee is sort of, in employment law, they use this phrase master-servant relationship, which sounds a bit sort of arcane, but that you sort of know what they mean. Basically, I'm an employee and IPSE basically can tell me what to do. And I sort of have to accept that. Whereas as a contractor, it would be more like we would agree the work that needs to be done and I'll go off and do it. Now, the client can ultimately say that they don't like the sound of the work being done and go and do it again, but they can't really control how I do the work that I do. You can also look at where the work is done. So, do I get to decide where it's done? Can I work from home if I want to, or work from the cafe if I want to, or do I have to be on the client's site? You can look at when the work is done. Do I have to work certain hours of the day, or can I choose my own hours? But I think the key thing is how the work is done. Does the client have oversight of the work I'm doing, or do I actually just say, no, I know what I'm doing here? So in the instance, for I think, particularly this audience, we have a lot of experts here in PR. Clients will engage you because you are the experts in that. And so you're sort of going to control a lot on how the work is done here, because they're engaging you to do that. So I think that that's a helpful pointer outside of IR35. A lot of the cases that we've seen around the TV presenters have come down to control and the amount of autonomy those presenters have over the work that they do. When they're presenting, who's in control here? Is it the BBC, or is it Kay Adams or Lorraine Kelly, she's ITV? But because that's a couple of recent cases that we have had, and the tribunals have, well, particularly with Lorraine Kelly. So no, Lorraine Kelly is in control of what she's doing. So IR35 does not apply.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's clearly been very useful for everyone. So I'm going to draw it to a close as we're out of time, and say thank you very much to Andy. What I'll do over the next week or two is I'll pull together a load of links from IPSI and CIPR and other organisations just to share with everyone, so there's more reading. So, but yeah, in the meantime, do feel free to look on the CIPR website. There's draft contracts for members. There's lots on the IPSI website, and also if you are an independent and not a CIPR member, we are offering a reduced discount for joining CIPR at the moment. We're waiving a £55 membership fee, I think, for the next 3 months as something to do to support independence. And is there anything else you'd like to add at all, Andy?
No, just thanks very much for inviting me on, and yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for watching and for your questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone, and have a good weekend.